ever had a nap that was so good that when you wake up, you really don't know where you are and like what day it is? Yeah? Okay, I had one of those naps once, and I opened my eyes, and it takes me a few moments to like figure out where I am. And as I start to look around, I realize I am on an airplane. And as I'm looking around, I'm like, okay, what day is this? I don't really know, and the reason I didn't know is because I had been in transit at this point for about 33 hours. I was flying to Europe, and I had like a 10-hour layover in England, and I was on a flight from Zurich, Switzerland to Frankfurt, Germany. And when I opened my eyes, it really was one of those things like I was sleeping so hard on that airplane, I didn't know where I was or like what was happening. But then the next thing that occurred to me is I can't really see very well. Now, I wear glasses. I'm wearing contacts right now, but without my corrective lenses, I am basically blind. I sometimes wonder, like, if I'd been born, 1,500 years earlier, if, like, I would be able to function in society at all. Like, I have no sight whatsoever without my glasses. And as I open my eyes, I realize I can't see anything. And so I reach over to the seat next to me, and my glasses are not there. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. Where did they go? And then as I start to piece things together, I remember that when I got on the airplane, they were on my face, and now I have no idea where they are. And I know sometimes when you wake up like from like a really good nap, you're not always thinking logically. So I start doing the they're probably by my feet, and so I'm leaning over, like patting the ground because I can't actually see, so I'm having to feel for it. And like that's not there, so I'm leaning over into the aisle, I'm patting around, and I just look like a crazy person as I'm like feeling all around for my glasses. And for like 5 or 6 minutes, like I'm just searching for my glasses until finally somebody 4 rows back is like, sir, did you lose these? And I finally pieced everything together. I had fallen asleep on the airplane. My glasses had fallen off my face. They had slid about 4 rows back. And it was just one of those days. And sometimes you just wake up and you're like, how did I get here? That was true on an airplane that one time, but, every now and then in life, you just wake up one day, you look around at the circumstances around you, and you just ask yourself that question, how did I get here? Luckily, we're not the first ones to ever, struggle with this type of moment, where as we look at our circumstances, we look at our life, and we don't necessarily like exactly how things have lined up, and we start to ask that question, how did I get here? Luckily, we're not the first ones to ever deal with this. In fact, I'm going to tell you the story this morning. It's about a guy named David. And if you've ever studied the Bible, if you've been in church for a while, if you maybe grew up in Sunday school, you know a lot of stories about David. David's a guy who wrote the Psalms. Like the middle of your Bible, it's like the biggest book that we've got in the entire scriptures, and it's just full of poems and songs that were mostly written by this guy named David. Some of you might have heard a story once about a guy named David who killed a giant named Goliath. He was 15 years old. And he becomes the biggest warrior in his entire nation. But in 1 Samuel chapter 30, we don't see David the giant slayer. We don't see David the psalmist. We see a very different David. So if you would join me, we're in 1 Samuel 30. We're going to start in verse 1. It'll be up on the screen if you want to follow along in your Bible. You just open in the middle, start going to the left. Eventually, you're going to find a book called 1 Samuel, and that's where we're going to start this morning. So this is 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 1. It says, 3 days later, when David and his men arrived home at their town of Ziklag, they found the Amalekites had made a raid into the Negev and Ziklag, and they had crushed Ziklag, and they had burned it to the ground. So let's recap a little bit before we jump into the rest of this. Ziklag is the name of the city where David lived. David had been a warrior for years, but at this point in his life, he's on the run. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he has an army of about 600 men. He has an army of 600 mighty men that would follow David wherever they go. And as they enter into their city, as they enter into their town where they lived, they look around and they see it's, burning. The ashes are there. But also as they look at it a little bit closer, they realize we're not seeing any bodies. David and his army had been out to war, but their wives and their children had stayed back. And as they look around at the rubble, they're noticing that there are no remains of any other person. It says that in verse 2, they had carried off the women and children and everyone else, but without killing anyone. And you might at first think, oh, this is good news. This is good news that, the wives and the children are alive. But put yourself in David's shoes. This is probably the worst news you can possibly get. Because as you're looking around, you would hope that you would at least see somebody. You would see the remains of somebody, because the potential for what is happening if they are still alive might be worse than their death. You don't know if your little girl, if your daughters are going to be sold into a sexual slavery. You don't know what's happening to your wives. You don't know if your boys are going to be put into some sort of internment camp, or they're going to be put to work and they're going to be slaves for somebody else. And so as you look around and you don't see bodies, this is not comforting. This is a really scary moment for David. And he's looking around and he's wondering, how did I get here? What happened in my life to lead to this moment? It keeps going. It says, when David and his men saw the ruins and realized what had happened to their families, they wept until they could not weep anymore. Verse 5. David's 2 wives, okay, quick timeout. Okay, I get it. This is the quick timeout on all this. Like, we're seeing some polygamy in the Bible, all right? Just so you know, the Bible does not endorse this. It's just something that, it showed up, but it's not something that was really part of God's plan. So don't let that shake you from anything. Going on, Ananiam from Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel, were among those who were captured. Verse 6. David was now in great danger, because all his men were very bitter about losing their sons and daughters, and they began to talk of stoning him. So David, this great warrior, David, the guy who wrote the Psalms, David, who had killed the giant, he is now standing in the midst of a burned down city. He's lost his wives, he's lost his children, and now he's losing the army. They're on the verge of stoning him. They're on the verge of killing him, and he is wondering, how did I get here? Now, have you ever been in a situation like this? You wake up one day and your marriage is in ruins and you're wondering, how did I get here? One day you wake up and you realize you've lost your job and you're wondering, how did I get here? What happened in my life to lead to this moment? You wake up one day and your kids are a mess and you're wondering, how did I get here? You wake up one morning and you just think to yourself, I don't like my life. I don't like the situation I'm in. I don't like the circumstances. I don't like who I live with. I don't like my job. I don't like my life. How did I get here? Well, we want to look and see how David got to this situation in his life, but in order to understand how all this happened, we need to understand where he came from. Real early in David's life, there was another king. His name was Saul, and there was no relation between David and Saul. God had put Saul, the king, in power over Israel, but after a while, Saul proved that he was not fit to be king, and God said, I'm going to choose a new king. And so this prophet named Samuel goes to David's family and says, I know that the king is here. And so he looks around the family. He looks at the oldest son. He's like, that's not it. That's not the king. He looks at the next oldest son. He's like, no, that's not the one whom God has chosen. He looks at the next oldest. Nope, still not the king. And he looks at Jesse, David's dad, and says, where is the rest of your boys? Where are the rest of them? They're like, and Jesse, David's father, says, oh, well, there is David. He's still out there, but trust me, he's just a shepherd. He's probably not going to be the king. And Samuel says, no, bring him to me. And real early in David's life, God reveals through the prophet Samuel, you are going to be king. There's another story where Saul, the king who had been in power, starts like being tormented by depression and all sorts of thoughts of anxiety, and he knew that music would calm him down. And David was a great harp player. And this is in a day and age where you can't just pull something up on your iPhone or pull something up on your computer and listen to it. Like, you need to bring in a musician. So he brings in David, this harpist, and he would come and he would play for the king. David, at the age of 15, goes into battle and defeats a giant. He becomes this big rock star in all of Israel. He becomes this great warrior that he would lead the troops into battle, and he would have so much success that the women in the country started writing these songs about him. They would say things like, Saul the king, he's killed his thousands, but David, he's killed his tens of thousands. Like, the greatest warrior we had in our kingdom was Saul, but he pales in comparison to David. And so David's reputation starts to build. And what happens is Saul, the king, who is going to be replaced by David and is starting to notice that the tides are turning in his country, starts to get very jealous of David. And he starts plotting how he can put this guy out. Because if he can take David down, he can secure his throne for future generations, and he does not want to lose it for his family. So he starts plotting the death of David. David finds out about this, and he goes on the run. He escapes. And in his dark moment, in this moment where he is a fugitive in the city, he's done nothing wrong at this point in his life except be successful. He goes on the run, and he starts to attract other people. And eventually we get an army of 600 men who follow him and go everywhere and do anything with him. All the while, the king is plotting his death. But David is an honorable man. David is a man who understands that until God ends Saul's reign, I am not the king, he is. Because Saul is still God's anointed, and who am I to take the king out? And so even though David is not literally threatening Saul's reign at this moment, Saul is still trying to kill him. And one time, Saul goes into a cave, and he's going to relieve himself. And David is also hiding in this cave and has an opportunity to kill him at his most vulnerable moment. But he doesn't. He cuts off a corner of his robe and he goes out and he says, look, I could have killed you, but I didn't. Then a little bit later, Saul sets up camp in the middle of the wilderness as he's on one of those hunts trying to find David. And while they're in a deep sleep, David sneaks into the camp. He finds where Saul is sleeping. And he doesn't kill him. He doesn't cut off his head. He doesn't drive a spear through his heart. What he does is he actually takes the king's spear and he takes his water jug and he goes off to a far hill and he starts screaming across the valley, Saul, Saul. Saul wakes up, his army stands up, and they look. It says, I had an opportunity to kill you once again. Here's your spear, here's your water jug. And I chose not to do it. Because you are still God's anointed. I mean, to this point in David's life, it seems like he's done everything right, doesn't it? Like, he killed the giant when it was the challenge before him. He wrote the songs that eventually would become part of our own scriptures even to this day. When given the opportunity to end the life of the current king and put himself on the throne, he said, that's not my place. God has not removed him from power yet. And until God removes him from power, that's not my place. And so here the second time, where he's given the opportunity to end Saul's life and he chooses not to. Saul seems to have this turn of heart and he says, David, I'm not going to hunt for you anymore. But then something strange happens in David's own heart. After hearing from Saul, I'm sorry that I tried to kill you. I'm not going to hunt for you anymore. We see this slow slide start to begin in David's life that will eventually lead him to Ziklag. It says in 1 Samuel 27, 3 chapters earlier than when the city of Ziklag was burned down. But David kept thinking to himself, someday Saul is going to get me. The best thing I can do is escape to the Philistines. Then Saul will stop hunting for me in Israelite territory, and I will finally be safe. David's slow slide to Ziklag starts when he moves out of his neighborhood. David's first mistake is he began thinking to himself. He took the attention off of what God was guiding him to do and started thinking to himself. And for many of us, you might be sitting there right now in your chair thinking, I am the smartest person I know. It's true, right? Like isn't most of your life kind of determined by the fact that you think that your decisions are better than other people's, and so that's kind of where you find yourself? Well, David was in a similar boat. He started thinking to himself, someday the king's going to get me. I'm not safe here. Have you ever paid too much for something? Like maybe you've been on vacation in maybe like in Mexico or in the Caribbean, and you get onto the street and you get into the market and you see like this thing of art, and you're like, man, that looks really cool. And as you ask the person how much does it cost, they say $100. You're like, fine, deal. It's so beautiful. I'll give you $100. And then you turn the corner, you see the very same thing they're selling for $20. Have you guys ever been in that situation? Or maybe you go to the store and you buy something, and then you find out that across town you can get it for like $3 cheaper, and you're just like, oh, it grinds at you. Well, sometimes in life, we get what we want, but we find out that the price was way too high, right? Like sometimes we know what we're setting out to get, we know what we want, but when we actually pay the amount that it takes to get it, we find out a little bit later, wow, that was a lot steeper than I thought. And for David, the chance to find safety and the chance to escape this king who is hunting for him, he ultimately gets what he wants, but the price is really high. Do you remember that giant that David killed, that giant named Goliath? Do you know where he was from? He was from the Philistines. He was from this area called Gath. In fact, I want to show you a map. I want to show you a map just to show you where David is going, okay? So what happens is we see down here the orange on this map. And for those of you who are listening to the podcast, I'm sorry, just trust me that this is, that I'm telling you the truth. All right, so if you look on the map, the orange part is Israel territory, the Israelites. That's where David was from. That's his hometown. Like that's the home field advantage right there, the orange part. If you look over to the left, you see Philistia. And you might see up near the city of Eglon, north of that you see the city of Gath. David escapes the orange and he goes to that city called Gath. He goes to the Philistines. Now, something else to keep in mind. Remember the giant, Goliath. He was from Gath. At this point in history, the Israelites and the Philistines were like, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union. Also, I guess during the Cold War, it was like the Celtics and the Lakers, okay? It's Mario and Bowser, these are like mortal enemies. They just do not hang out. And what you've got here is you've got David moving out of his hometown. He's moving from the orange into Philistia to Gath. And as he gets to Gath, he presents himself to the king of Gath, the guy who represents a nation that he had killed thousands of people from. He says, I'm here, I'm your servant, I'm running from Saul, please help me stay safe. And so the king of Gath says, okay, I have a city for you. It's named Ziklag. You and your army can set up shop there. And so David moves from the orange to the city of Ziklag, which you can see is very close to the border of Israel. David moves out of the protection of God's chosen land. Ultimately, this is what David has done. The start of David's slow slide starts when he let the fears of his circumstances eclipse the protection of his God. David let the fears of his circumstances eclipse the protection of his God. And so as David and his army move to the city of Ziklag, they have to make a living somehow. They've got to eat, right? Like they need to put food on the table. And so they start taking an inventory of their skills, I guess, and they start thinking, okay, what are we really good at? And, despite what you might think, there's not really a big market for Israeli harpists in this day and age. So like that one was off the table, okay? Like David wasn't going to be able to do that. And I'm sure somebody in the back of the room's like, hey, we're really good at killing things. And they're like, that's a great idea. That's a marketable skill that we can use. And so the thing is, like during times of war, killing things is a great skill to have. But if you are trying to rely on killing things when you're not at war, unfortunately, you've basically just become a warlord, okay? So this is what David and his army do. It says in 1 Samuel 27, verse 8, it says, David and his men spent their time raiding the Gerishites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, people who had lived near Shur toward the land of Egypt since ancient times. And so just to understand a little bit more about the significance of what David and his army are doing, Just understand a little bit more about what the significance of what they're doing. During that day and age, the Philistines and then those other nations that I probably butchered the pronunciations of, they were kind of like the United States and the Soviet Union during World War II, okay? They weren't necessarily enemies, but they weren't necessarily like great friends, but there was definitely some sort of a loose alliance. And so David, as he's now living in the land of the Philistines, takes his army to start raiding potential allies of the nation that is offering him safe harbor. And it said in verse 9 that David did not leave one person alive in the villages he attacked. He took the sheep, the goats, the cattle, the donkeys, camels, and clothing before returning home to see King Achish. Sometimes we run the risk when we read the Bible that when we see somebody who is elevated as a hero in other parts of Scripture that we say everything they did in life was great. And let me tell you right now, what David is doing is not great. As he's going into these cities, and he's raiding them, he's killing every man, woman, and child, taking and plundering everything that they have and taking it back to the Philistines. This is not a good look for him. And as he gets to the king of Gath, the mortal enemy of the Israelites, the king looks at his stuff and he says, wow, you're bringing a lot of stuff back with you. How are you getting all this? And so David, at this point, he could tell the truth. He could say, well, I'm raiding these cities. But David gets very vague. And he actually says something to the effect of, oh, I'm going like south of Judah. You know, Judah's part of Israel. So it's like, hey, I'm going like south of there. Which he knows the king is going to hear is this. David's going back into Israel. He's raiding cities in the southern part of Israel, and that's where he's getting all this stuff. And the king hears this, and he thinks, man, this is awesome, because this lines David up with us even more. But David, he's walking this fine line where he's like, I'm going to tell enough of the truth to where I can't ever be accused of lying, but I'm also going to not be completely forthright either. And he lets the king of Gath start thinking more and more that David was on his side. And here's the second piece of David's slow slide to Ziklag. David's double life led to ambiguity. He wasn't completely honest. He wasn't completely truthful. And then maybe the saddest chapter of this part of David's life, one day the king of Gath, the king of this enemy to Israel, summons David, and he says, you've told me for the last 16 months that you are my servant. I've offered you protection. You've paid your tribute. Well, I'm going to war. And I'm going to war with the Israelites, and I need you with me. And so David, at this point, is so deep into this double life. He's so deep into this slow slide that he ends up going into battle carrying the flag for his arch rivals. He gets to the battlefront, and the other nations who have joined with the Philistines, they look and they see David walking into the camp, and they say, Achish, you can't be serious. Wasn't it this guy that just years ago they wrote songs about saying this guy's killed his tens of thousands? We are the tens of thousands. You can't let this guy fight with us. And so they have a hard meeting, and they actually say, David, we're sorry, but you can't actually be here today. So they turn David and his army away, and they start having the slow walk back to their city of Ziklag. And as they start walking back to Ziklag, I wonder if David started thinking through just the events of his life. How as an early member of the king's court, he had been this celebrated musician, how he had gone to battle and had brought great victory to the Israelites. But now he's living a double life in a land that he's not from, having to raid other cities and literally not leaving a single person alive to keep the lies safe. And he just got turned away from battle, the thing he was best at in life, by the king that at an earlier point that he had promised to always protect his nation from. And as he's probably thinking through some of these things, they see the smoke rising in the distance. And at first, you start having this game where you're like, well, that can't be what I think it is. Like, it's probably a farmer burning his crops. It might even just be a wildfire that has gotten a lot of control. But as they get closer and closer to their city, it starts to set in that, no, that's not a wildfire. That's not a farmer. That seems to be from our city. They start getting a little bit closer. And the rubble you can smell it. And you can see how the things that they had left outside of their tents and outside of their buildings have now been removed. And David's thinking, how did I get here? He's self-exiled. He's been living a double life. He's been rejected by this new kingdom. And I believe that at this point in life, David was far from God. Interesting fact. From the moment David comes onto the scene in the Bible, we usually can find psalms that he wrote during every single chapter of his life. When he's a great warrior, there's songs and there's psalms and poems telling the story. When he is a fugitive on the run, there's psalms, there's songs, there's poems. Later in life, when he becomes king, there's songs, there's psalms, there's poems. But for this 16-month period where David is living as an exile in Ziklag, there are no psalms that we know of. Not a single poem, not a single song that he had written to God. For 16 months, David had been far from God. And I just want to be clear for a moment, okay? Just as an aside. Some of the terrible circumstances in your life are of no fault of your own. I understand that, okay? You can't help it if your parents got a divorce when you were a child and that, created some complexities as you got older in life. You can't help it if you were ever assaulted, molested, or attacked. Like, those are terrible circumstances that are of no fault of your own. That's not what I'm talking about. But for some of us, the greatest pain, the worst chapters of our entire life, they come out of decisions, they come out of actions, they come out of behaviors that we are completely at fault for. Some of the greatest pains and difficulties in our lives have a common culprit, and that's us. And it's so easy to talk ourselves into compromise, isn't it? You fear being alone, and so you compromise to keep him or her around. I don't want you to go anywhere, so whatever you want, I'll do it. You become loose with the truth around those who are even closest to you. It's like, officially this was like, she is a client, and so I'm not lying to my wife when I say I'm on a sales meeting, but there's a little bit more to the story than just that. You wake up one day and you're just in a mountain of debt just because of several small compromises that happen over time. And there's a lot of excuses you can try and come up with, but at the end of the day, when you look around, you realize that the culprit is nobody other than yourself. Jesus' brother, a guy named James, he actually put it this way in James 1, chapter 14, or verse 14 and 15. It says, "Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death." See, when temptation comes into our lives and we decide to act on it, maybe at first you can get away with it, and it's not a big deal. But it starts to grow, and it starts to multiply, and it starts to become this beast that you just can't really hold any longer. There's a progression. We know what we want, and ultimately we get it when we compromise. But like what happened for David, the price is often too high. For David, he wanted to escape the fear of the king coming after him. And so he moves out of the protection. He lets the fear of his circumstances eclipse the protection of his God, and he moves out of Israel. He starts becoming very loose with the truth. He starts perpetuating this lie of a double life that he has had going. And then eventually, when it had gotten too big to manage any longer, he ends up going into battle, holding the flag for a nation that at one point he had gone to battle against. And now he's arriving back in the city of Ziklag. And his family has been stolen. His possessions are gone. And he has essentially betrayed the men that he has sworn his life to. When David left the safety of God's wisdom, he opened himself up to disaster. When David left the safety of God's wisdom, he opened himself up to disaster. Here's just a question that you can wrestle with. Did God send the Amalekites to raid David's home? Maybe. I don't believe so, but maybe. But I can tell you this. Did David position himself in a situation where it made it more likely for something like this to happen? Absolutely. And for many of us, at one point in your life, when you decided to keep that beast fed, when you allowed your circumstances and you allowed your sin and yourself and your stuff to multiply and to morph into something that you can't manage any longer, it might not be God who sent the punishment. It might be that you have positioned yourself in a spot where it makes it easy for something like this to happen. You thought you could keep the secret from your wife, and now your marriage is on the rocks. You thought you could take just a little here and a little bit there, and nobody would notice, but now you're under suspicion at work. You thought you could live on 110% for a few months because the money would eventually start rolling in, and that just never happened. You thought you could talk trash about all your friends, but now you're dealing with the relational shrapnel of your gossip and your lies coming out. And so here's the question. What should our response be when we get to one of those, how did I get here moments? When it looks like your marriage is on the verge of collapse, when it looks like you've burned all the relational bridges in your life, when your reputation and your identity are on the rocks and you are embarrassed that you even have to present yourself in front of certain people, what do you do? Verse 6 of 1 Samuel 30. David was now in great danger because all his men were very bitter about losing their sons and daughters, and they began to talk of stoning him. But David found strength in the Lord. Here's the principle. When you reach the bottom, look up. When you get to the bottom of yourself, and it looks like things couldn't get any worse, look up. After 16 months of silence, 16 months where David didn't write a single psalm, a single poem, a single song that just was so part of who he was, David finds strength in the Lord. It is never too late to turn back to God. It is never too late to look up. Some of us think that there needs to be some sort of a probation period before you can ever turn back to God. That I need to put some distance between my terrible decisions and the person I want to be. I need to let there be some sort of a waiting period. That does not need to be the case. Your past does not have to determine your future. And so how do we find strength in the Lord? If you are in one of those how did I get here moments, or if you will ever be in one of those how did I get here moments, you need to find strength in the Lord. When you have reached the bottom, you need to make a decision right here, right now. I am going to look up. At Crosspoint, we have a core value. It's the core value of spiritual growth, and we say it this way. God desires that we take next steps to stay close and to stay clean. We choose daily to go God's way over the world's way. And it doesn't matter what yesterday looked like. Today we take those next steps to stay close and to stay clean. We're going to choose daily to go God's way over the world's way. And so here are some ways that you can find strength in the Lord your God. The first is this. You need to make him your God. Some of you are trying to figure out whether you believe in this whole church and God thing at all. And I'm telling you right now that if you are having those thoughts in your heart, God is probably prompting you to make a decision that you are going all in with this Jesus guy. And today is the day where you can decide that I am going to make him my God. Another way that you can find strength in the Lord is you start talking to him. Start talking to him. We use the term prayer. And literally, it's just a conversation between you and God. Some of you are like, man, I'm not very good at prayer. Like, that's not something like I can really do. I can tell you right now, if you're good at work, like if you love to worship, if you love to come into this room and you love to sing, chances are your prayer life is better than you think. Because the words that we recite, the words that we sing, most of the time, these are just simply prayers that we are giving to God. Trust me, if you can worry, you can pray. Just start talking to God. You might consider writing it out. You might consider changing your posture. But just start talking to God. It doesn't matter where you start, just take those next steps. Maybe a way that you can find strength in the Lord your God is you start reading. You just download the YouVersion Bible app, pick up a Bible. If you need one, we will get one to you. We want to make sure that it's not hard for you to find a Bible to start reading. And just start somewhere. Start reading somewhere. If you need to, listen. There's ways that you can listen to the Bibles, but no matter who you are or where you're at, if you've reached the bottom, look up. Find your strength in the Lord your God. And I'll just finish the story up real quick, and then our band's going to come up to the stage, and we'll get on with our morning. But as David finds strength in the Lord, God tells him, David, at this moment, I want you to rally your men together. And I want you to go on pursuit. David says, I'm tired. And God says, I don't care. I want you to go. So he rallies his men together, and they start off on a trek to find the Amalekites. They get to a river, 200 are too tired to keep going, and only 400 actually make their way to the Amalekites, but God gives them great victory. And what we learn is that God restored every man, woman, child, possession into their possession. God gave it all back. I believe that many of us are on a spiritual breakthrough. We're on the precipice of a spiritual breakthrough even this morning. That you feel like your life can't get any worse than it is right now. But God is telling you, find strength in me. Look up. And I'll restore the life that I have designed for you and desired for you. And it might not look exactly the way you think it. It might not be exactly the way it turned out for David. But God has great plans in store for you. God has a great future for you. But many of us, we're at rock bottom. And you can either choose to allow the stones that could be flung in, or you can choose today to find strength in the Lord. Your past does not have to determine your future. Let's pray. God, we love you, and we thank you for giving us this roadmap. This roadmap to find strength in you, the roadmap to determine today that when we reach the bottom, we're looking up. God, I pray that we would not be fearful. That God, that we wouldn't feel like we need to put distance between our mistakes and our future. But God, that you remind us that through Jesus, today is a new day, and we have new hope. God, I know that you are a good God that desires great things for us. And so I pray, God, that today you would restore the joy of our salvation. That, God, that today you would give the prayer onto the hearts of the people who feel called to make you their God this morning. The prayer that says, I'm going all in with you, God. That today I'm choosing to make you the Lord of my life. And God, I pray for us to have spiritual breakthroughs, for us to have miracles to happen, and for us to see great things in our community and in our families and in our city. And I pray this in your name. Amen. At this time.